it's really powerful to see how much interest there is out there, wherever out there is, because we can't see it, in these kinds of questions. So it's really great.
Yeah, I've been really excited about this since I heard about it last year sometime, or whenever. I've been really looking forward to it. It's really a shame not to be able to do it together in person in New York. That would be
Yes, although I think this has some benefits. Okay, so I'm going to count about 30 seconds and then I'm going to go. Okay. So I want to say good afternoon to all the people who are literally streaming into this. I am Hasia Diner, a professor of American Jewish history at New York University. And I'm the director of the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History, which is the funder of this conference, or one of the funders of this conference. But the conference is being hosted by Jewish Currents. Initially, the conference was supposed to be at NYU in person. Obviously, COVID took that chance out of our hands. But also because of COVID, there was a strong sense that, and in conjunction with the work of our contingent faculty, who asked all academics to hold their conferences elsewhere, in solidarity with contingent faculty whose status and situations in the universities have been so exacerbated for the worse by COVID. So Jewish Currents was more than able and willing to take up the slack. But the Goldstein-Gorin Center is still very much the, I guess now not silent partner. Before making one comment about these sessions and turning this over to the moderator, I do want to give top billing to Hadass Binyamini and Natalia Shevin, two PhD students at NYU who conceived of this from the bottom up. This is their work, their vision, their labor, and I am, I guess, just the funder, as well as their PhD advisor. So what I think is really important about the two sessions that came before and this one and the next one is that it brings together academics and activists. It links past and present and no doubt future. And we want to think about what can historians contribute to contemporary activism, and what can we very selfishly as historians learn about our own subject from hearing what contemporary activists have to say. So it's not talking in separate streams, but really creating a synergy between different kinds of commentators and players. So I am going to now turn this over to your moderator, Rachel Cohen, who is a journalist based in Washington, D.C. She covers issues of labor, politics, education, among many other topics. She's reported for outlets including the Washington Post, The Atlantic, and she is a contributing writer to Intercept and, importantly, Jewish Currents, our host. Rachel.
Thank you. And welcome, everybody. We have so far 134 people joining in on a Thursday afternoon to talk about Jewish class history and current activism. So I think that's awesome. And thank you so much for the opportunity to facilitate this rare and cool and unique and special conversation. I'm very excited about it. It's tackling some of my favorite topics. And we have just this fantastic set of panelists with us today over Zoom, unfortunately, but we're making do. I can read you our panelist bio, but I think what is more meaningful is to hear from them, for them to introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about what they're excited to talk about. And if this is your first day tuning into this conference, going off of what was just said, it's not typical that we have usually historians and activists, and I'm going to put journalists in there into the mix too, because all of these people are not typically in conversation, and we also have so many more people now tuning in from all sorts of backgrounds, and I'm very excited to get to the Q&A. So when that happens, feel free and please do send your questions throughout the panel. And the way it's worked in previous days is people can sort of upvote questions and rank them. So, but if it's a good question and it didn't get upvoted, we might ask it anyway. So without further ado, Mark, how about you, Professor Dollinger, you start, yeah, thanks.
Great, good afternoon, great to be here and thrilled to contribute. I'm Mark Dollinger, I teach in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. What I love about teaching and writing history is historical memory, or more specifically, historical forgetfulness. And that is, what are the ways in which largely American Jews, identified American Jews, think about their social justice past against what was the past actually like. And I began working on the civil rights movement of the 50s and early 60s. And for my recent book, I was most interested in the American Jewish turn inward in the late 60s and 70s, the rise of American Zionism, Soviet Jewry movement, increased religiosity. And I was all ready to dive into the book. And the more I went into the sources, the more I got pulled back to the Black Power movement. And the book ended up being a retelling of the story of the alliance between white Jews and Blacks, and a retelling of even Jewish organizational understandings of the Black Power movement and the ways in which this inverted the racial hierarchy, where white Jews were now learning from Black activists on how to be better Jews.
And I would be remiss not to say that I reviewed Mark Dollinger's book for Jewish Currents 2 years ago, I think. And so this is my first time meeting him through this project, but I thought the book was great, and I'm excited to draw out some of the ideas in this conversation. Okay, Gabe, would you like Professor Wynant?
Gabe's fine. My name is Gabe Wynant. I teach history at the University of Chicago. I'm generally a historian of labor and the labor movement and political economy in the United States. I was very proud to contribute once to Jewish Currents, a review of the biography of the historian Eric Hobsbawm. But anyway, I'm very glad to be here generally, and thanks Rachel and to all of the people who've done work to make this event happen. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. I think I'm here in particular on this panel because of something I wrote in N+1 a year or so ago, called an essay called The Professional Managerial Class, which I imagine we'll be talking about more today.
Carlin, do you want to go?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlin. Pronouns are they, them, or she, her. I am definitely the activist and not the historian component of this panel. I organize with the New York Caring Majority, which is a campaign of the Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, or JFREJ. However, our activism is deeply rooted not only in our own historical activism, but in the labor movement. And I am constantly reminded how lessons from history impact our activism today. So I'm so excited about a discussion that brings together historians and activists and reporters, and really excited to learn from folks. At the Caring Majority, we are organizing for universal long-term care, for dignified jobs and wages for home care workers and domestic workers. And all of that cuts across so many of the lines that our historian experts on the panel are going to be discussing today. So really excited to be here with all of you and having this talk.
Awesome. So the sort of parameters of this panel, they're pretty broad. We wanted to look at the 60s and the 70s primarily, although also tying that to present day, thinking about sort of the narratives that there are certain narratives that we have both about Americans in the post-war era in the 60s, 70s, about Jewish Americans, about the labor movement, about the economy. And I think something that is really great about the panelists we have today is they've done a lot of work to both study those narratives, but also pick apart, where they have not held up, or questioning why it is that we have obscured certain aspects or forgotten things, as Mark was saying. And so I thought maybe we would start with Gabe. So Gabe, you have done some really interesting historical research on organizing that took place at a hospital in Pittsburgh, 1970s. I was hoping you could start by talking a little bit about what was so unique about that organizing in that period, and also why that time period is actually at odds with a lot of the narrative that we typically think of when we talk about the 1970s economy and what was happening with unions and with workers, and why that is a bit of a exception.
Yeah, absolutely. So the article that you're referring to, Rachel, is one that I wrote on kind of an example of a much broader phenomenon in the 70s, which was a crisis in nursing homes. So the institution was called the hospital, but it was actually a very large public nursing home. And around the country in the, basically from the mid 70s into the mid 80s, there was a kind of ongoing crisis of long-term care, which was becoming manifest in overcrowding and abuse of patients and residents of long-term care institutions. The case in Pittsburgh, which is the one I've studied really closely, basically, long-term care is largely funded by Medicaid, and secondarily, in this case, because it was a publicly owned institution, the county, tax revenues were under a lot of pressure from the downward economic turn in industrial places like Pittsburgh in the 70s. And this led to both overcrowding, because you had more older and disabled people who were kind of at the end of their rope and wound up in an institution, and simultaneously understaffing because the budget was being cut. So the combination of overcrowding and understaffing then led to more or less the torture of residents. A pretty horrific story, and not an uncommon one throughout this period. But I think what's interesting about the story is, first of all, the way that this particular case in Pittsburgh was exposed and the kind of political consequences of it. And then secondarily, what we can kind of read from that about the larger transformation of this time. So it was exposed by a group of 3 people. First, a woman named Mary Lewin, who worked there as a social worker, and then who recruited 2 of her friends, Emily Eckel and Joseph Nagy, to get jobs there and join her in exposing it from the inside. And Eckel and Nagy had been members of the organization, the New American Movement, which folks may know today as one of the 2 groups that merged to form DSA in the early 80s. New American Movement came out of SDS, so Students for Democratic Society. It was a socialist feminist organization. And this, I think, is why it's of interest to our conversation today. It really was, I think, quite centrally focused on understanding the problem of the failure of SDS, the defeat of the white New Left, in terms of the gap between the traditional working class and professionals. And there was a huge discourse and conversation all through the 70s.
Can I pause? Can you just, for viewers' sake, can you say, what the New Left and the SDS were? Just for
yes. So when we talk about the New Left, and in particular the kind of white New Left, like beginning with the anti-war movement really in the 60s on campuses, and then more broadly with Students for Democratic Society being its kind of main organ. And that organization split famously at the end of the 60s, quite acrimoniously. And that set off a lot of debate over what had not worked, of which the New American Movement was one kind of participant in that debate. And basically, what figures in the New American Movement largely argued was that, or believed, was that it was a mistake to believe, well, let me take a step back. So when SDS split, more or less the 2 factions split over the question, at least theoretically, of how to understand its members' own class position. And some argued for a very broad definition of the working class that would include student radicals, that would include their kind of would-be allies, the Black Panthers. And some argued for a very narrow definition, which is to say, basically industrial workers. And there was a big debate over what actually is the class position of the student left. Is it a kind of new working class because jobs are increasingly professional jobs? How should we understand these people's role in society? And the New American Movement argued, generally, or a lot of its kind of key thinkers argued, that it's important neither to collapse professionals into the elite, the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, nor to make them synonymous with workers, but to acknowledge that they are genuinely in an in-between position. And that means that it's not the right strategy for us to try to make ourselves into workers by getting jobs in coal mines and steel mills, as Maoists and Trotskyists are arguing for, nor is it the right thing to assume that we're kind of already there. But in fact, we have to consider all of the contradictions embodied in the social position of the professional worker and try to radicalize from there, radicalize the professional workplace. And there are quite a few movements throughout the 70s really aiming at doing this, including, I would argue, this effort at this particular institution in Pittsburgh. But there really all of the professions saw versions of this strategy develop. And I'll conclude, sorry for the long comment, I'll just conclude by saying what's quite striking about the Pittsburgh story is that they won. So they exposed this scandal. There was a big struggle over it. The county immediately tried to privatize the institution, but actually these activists were able to put together a coalition of elder advocates and workers and professionals in keeping with this kind of theory, and to hold off the privatization drive and keep the institution public, which it remains today. And it shows us, I think, a kind of unusual counterpoint to the general trend of that period, which is obviously privatization and neoliberalism. And so I think there's a lesson about the role of the welfare state potentially and healthcare in particular and elder care in certain kinds of activism.
Thank you. And it's definitely, listening to you talk, I mean, I feel like those debates about who are actually workers, what is the working class, where do upper middle class or middle class professionals fall into all that is all still raging today in many of our debates and conversations. And I think reading your work, one thing that was really striking is that these workers in the New American Movement, these precursor to DSA, they formed this class analysis about where they stood in the hierarchy of this hospital and in this community of Pittsburgh, and they didn't shy away from it, and they basically leveraged it to help save this hospital. But now the term that they coined sort of resurfaced during our 2020 primary season in an essay that you wrote about, but it took on a much more negative valence, I think, than it had in the 1970s when the workers originally coined it. And so I guess I know we want to kind of move on, but before we do, I am hoping you could talk a little bit about why you think it sort of it became more that the professional managerial class, the PMC, became more of a slur sort of than it was 4 decades ago.
Yeah, so the idea of I'll try to answer this briefly because I want to hear from other folks too. But the idea of the professional managerial class was coined by Barbara and John Ehrenreich, who were members of New American Movement. Barbara Ehrenreich obviously has gone on to great fame since then. And it was an idea developed exactly in relationship to this problem of how to understand the social position of the young new left and what kinds of action might be useful and constructive and what kinds were not likely to succeed. And basically they argued that professionals are both in a position of operating sort of social control mechanisms over the working class and also simultaneously are themselves subject to sort of the downward pressure of proletarianization. And that's why it makes it possible for professionals to align politically with subordinated people, although their general orientation is not going to produce that automatically. But that can be organized. Is more or less the kind of purpose of that thesis. I wrote the essay on the professional managerial class last year because I had noticed PMC being used in the kind of Bernie world somewhat to criticize sort of liberals, basically, who were seen as, not class conscious enough, supporting Warren instead of Sanders often. And, I supported Sanders, and I think there's some validity to that critique. But I also think that it was also coming from people who very obviously were themselves generally part of the professional stratum. And what's different between the 1970s and the present is the enormous downward economic pressure that professionals have experienced, which has caused career paths to degrade very intensely. And I think there's a good deal of, in many ways, very understandable acrimony that's resulted between more and less insecure fragments of the formerly coherent PMC, which explains why the term has kind of gone through this transformation and become a kind of epithet. But I also think that process really has raised tremendous political possibility for people to reorient how we identify ourselves politically, and where our loyalties lie, less with the kind of the professional institutions of law and education and medicine and so on, and more with the working class. So that was the kind of thesis of the essay.
Thank you. I want to just sort of jump a little bit to Carlin, and we'll come back then to the 60s with Mark after. But Carlin, going off of what Gabe was talking about, you do a lot of cross-class, cross-racial organizing. You also organize with JFridge, with a lot of Jewish Americans in New York City. I would love to hear kind of how do people reckon with their class position when they go into this kind of activism? I think this is something that Jewish Currents has done a lot of interesting exploration about in the past couple of years, but I think it's sort of as we are navigating this landscape to organize and to do kind of make the world a better place for all people, I'm curious to hear how in your circles, whether people's own backgrounds, are featured or sort of put aside to create more sameness, or however you want to put it.
That's a great question. And I think a lot of what Gabe was talking about really resonates in a lot of what we're seeing in our organizing right now. So when we're talking about organizing in the long-term care sector and in the home care space, you're really talking about two groups of people that are very closely related. People that are receiving long-term care, often in their homes, sometimes in nursing homes, and then people that are employed to provide long-term care. And there are often huge differences when it comes to race and class. So home care workers, for example, are mostly women of color, often immigrants. 15% of home care workers are undocumented compared to, roughly 5% of the general workforce, depending on what numbers you look at. Whereas people that are receiving long-term care are obviously across the spectrum, because aging is something that cuts across class lines. But a lot of the people that we organize when it comes to people that are receiving long-term care, seniors, people with disabilities, are of the professional managerial class. And something that we really see here is that when it comes to receiving long-term care, you actually see a lot of what's called, class transition. So people that may have been of the professional managerial class their entire lives are coming to terms with the fact as they get older that, in fact, because our healthcare system is so rooted in pulling profit from our sickness and does not really have any sort of interest in allowing us to age with dignity, that in fact, no matter what your class background for most of your professional life was, that in fact, you can't afford to age in your home with dignity. The average cost of nursing care is $120,000 a year. And that is really unaffordable for the vast majority of us, regardless of whether you came from a PMC background, from the middle class, whatever it might be. And so we organize with a lot of people that are transitioning across class lines for the first time in their lives, maybe. And I think that this is actually where it's really important to think about the history of our own movement when it comes to building that solidarity among different classes and among race. So, you know, a lot of our current work around winning universal long-term care and around winning dignified wages and working conditions for home care workers was really born out of a campaign at JFRED's Jews for Racial and Economic Justice that started in 2002, Shalom Bayit, which means peace in the home in Hebrew. And that was the name of our campaign to organize domestic employers. So people who either had you know, domestic employers like cleaners or caretakers, whether for children or older adults in their homes. And the idea was to organize Jews that were, you know, either former or current employers of domestic workers and around the idea of a domestic workers bill of rights. And that was actually the campaign that, along with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, led to the passing of the 2010 Domestic Workers Bill of Rights in New York State, which is the first bill of its kind in the United States. And we're actually now seeing similar bills being passed or similar pushes for bills at the national level coming out of that campaign. But the reason that I mention this is because the initial idea behind this campaign was really a solidarity campaign. So the idea was folks that were of the professional managerial class or of the middle class were actually going to be organizing around the rights of the people that they employed and the people that they brought into their homes. But as we moved through this campaign and as we continued to do this organizing, what we really found is that we had to move from a solidarity campaign model to more of a mutual interest or an interdependence campaign model, because what we actually saw is that the people that we were organizing with were getting older and they were facing the problem of not being able to afford home care. And so this became a campaign that was, you know, while based in the idea of solidarity, actually very much in their own interest. And so by kind of taking on that framework of mutual interest, of the idea that, you know, our collective liberation is actually very much tied up in each other, and that cuts across race and class lines. But by also, you know, really recognizing that there is a big difference across race and class, which we can of course get into more later. That was a lot of where we really drew that campaign from.
And just before we move on, because this is what you work on, but I don't know if everyone listening in knows, and it's definitely like one of the policy ideas that gives me the most excitement when I think about it. But I was hoping you could just also tell a little bit about what you know, universal family care is that you're working on, and universal long-term, because I think that also really embodies the mutual self-interest for everyone in a way that goes far beyond just a solidarity campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea of universal long-term care is that we all deserve to age the way that we want to age, with dignity, and to be able to afford it. You know, 90% of people in the United States would prefer to age in their homes, yet most of our dollars are spent on nursing homes. And we're seeing this growing crisis because of a rapidly aging population, where a lot of people are not being allowed to make that choice that they want because they can't afford it, because there is a huge gap between the people that need home care and the workers that are there to provide it. And that's deeply tied up in the fact that those are jobs that are minimum wage, that are not with good working conditions or career ladders. And a vision for universal long-term care is one in which we all can age in our homes with dignity. And that ties very closely to universal family care, because we know that care isn't just at the end of our lives. It is all throughout our lives. And we know that the impacts of not having universal childcare affect us across generations, as parents are making decisions about caring for their children as well as their own parents, and people are making decisions about what they can and can't afford, because our current systems aren't set up to allow all of us to receive the care we need, and the people that provide that care to be adequately and well compensated to do it and be provided with dignified workplaces. And particularly on the home care side, it is a growing crisis, because we're seeing a very rapidly aging population. In New York alone, we're going to see 1 million more New Yorkers that are over the age of 65 in the next decade. And we don't have a plan to do with that, because our current structure right now is built to draw profit and rather than provide care. And so that's the campaign that we are fighting for together, is recognizing that all of that, the care that we receive, the jobs, the working conditions, are all tied up together.
So we've now had the pretty, Gabe has studied people organizing around long-term care in the 70s. Carlin is organizing around long-term care in 2020. I want to jump to the 1960s and talk a little bit, bring a little bit of American Jewish questions that Mark Dollinger has written so well about. I think one of the things that there are certain narratives that we have about American Jews in the post-world time, especially, that American Jews just all, became, rose up the economic ladder, that they, all were liberal, or most of them, and they all supported the civil rights movement. That's another one. Mark, I would love for you to talk a little bit about some of the things you learned that didn't quite fit in that mold, and why you think our historical understanding of American Jews has sort of ossified in the way it did. Like, are there advantages to that understanding then, and that's why it's become so sticky, or what do you think is sort of going on when you study the history?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, there's a whole lot of advantages to the way that we've seen historical memory, to be sure. And I'm appreciating both Gabe and Carlin's views, and I'm sort of in my own head kind of reworking a lot of my own thoughts. And for me, on a class basis, it's what happens when working class white urban Jews of the 20s and 30s become middle class suburban Jews in the 50s and 60s, right? So I think that's probably the best class frame to have. And while there was a profound class difference, there was also a reinvention of themselves as white liberals. And the classic understanding would sort of define, and I work mostly on interracial relationships, the white Jewish black alliance of the 50s as coming for one of three reasons. First, the historical memory went, well, blacks and Jews both have a common history of oppression. So a common history should bring the two groups naturally together into solidarity. The second is a sociological argument related to the history that, white Jews, because of anti-Semitism, know what it's like to be marginalized. Blacks understand with racism. Therefore, quite logically, blacks and Jews should get together. And the third argument is the Judaism argument, especially the prophetic Judaism, that the religion of the Jews demands a social justice mandate. So Jews, as Jews, regardless of their class status, need to be helpful. And I'll just tell you, I was raised with that particular frame when I came through, so the organized Jewish community's educational framework. And then early on, I realized three things. First, American Jewish history and African-American history could not be more fundamentally different. Jews have to go back to ancient Egypt to get to slavery, right? And as a friend and colleague of mine, an African-American scholar of race and ethnicity who used to head the state of New Jersey's Black Jewish Alliance used to tell me, he gets invited to a lot of Passover Seders back in the day. And he said, if I have another white Jewish family, tell me they know what it's like to be a Black man in America because they too were slaves in the land of Egypt, I'll scream, right? So the history argument doesn't work. And for middle-class white suburban Jews of the 1950s to think or internalize that their allyship with Black Americans is rooted in a common historical experience just doesn't cut it. And similarly, the marginal sociological argument also fails. Eric Goldstein at Emory has done a lot of work on Jews and whiteness and points out that the interracial alliance didn't occur until after American Jews had left the working class, entered the middle class, become white, as Karen Brodkin wrote about it earlier. And with this, only within the middle class white status could and would Jews reach across. And the third one, and for any rabbis present, here it goes. If we're going to use Judaism as the motivating force for allyship, we would imagine the Orthodox community would be the most engaged because for them, normative halakha, Jewish law, governing their day-to-day lives would mandate participation. In fact, traditionally observant Jews are the least engaged in this kind of work. The reform movement was the most, but to be honest, as I know the other panelists are aware, it was Jewish leftists, secular Jewish leftists, socialists and communists who were the ones who were doing the hard work. So the historical memory comes in when a whole lot of northern white suburban families watching this on TV are internalizing as if it were them as sort of a leftist Jewish young person fighting back and forth. So let me just pause there at that moment and see if you can follow up.
Well, I guess I just want to, at least on the first part, when you said, we'd have to go back to ancient Egypt to be slaves, that's definitely true. But I think a lot of Jewish people, when they are, raising and thinking about their experience and how it might relate, they'll be very different in important ways to the Black experience. They're not going back to Egypt in their minds. They're going to like the Holocaust, or they think about anti-Semitism and more recently, how white supremacy overlaps with racism and anti-Semitism. And I agreed with your work about some of the simplistic, connections that, some Jewish people who, say they're more oppressed than they are, or try to act as if they are oppressed like a Black person in the United States. But I don't feel like I guess I wonder if you think there is, more, you seem very dismissive of the idea that there's any sort of shared experience. And I guess I know a lot of Jewish people who don't feel that way. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious. I'm curious if Gabe or Carlin, if you want to weigh in on that either.
Yeah, if I can jump in first, only to agree and to say that I'm making both an historical and a historiographical argument, for the sake of putting the argument out. And I want to play on sort of what I was picking up from Gabe's comments, what I would describe as Jewish liminality. What is it to be part of two different social groups simultaneously? A whole lot of the motivation for civil rights work came from Holocaust consciousness and from that sense. And in the current political environment, Jews have faced the worst cases of anti-Semitism in American Jewish history, shot dead while they prayed. It has never been worse. What I want to do, though, is to try to distinguish between those that are the activists who are doing the work and what comprises them, against the vast majority that are collectivizing a memory that actually isn't true for them and where they're at. And then my optimism actually, Rachel, comes right on what you were arguing, which is one of my critiques of the interracial alliance of the 50s and 60s is it was at least understood in memory as this false idea of white Jews believing as if they understood what it was like to be, in this case, Black in America, when they actually didn't. And in fact, I'm not ascribing that to those who were actually down there protesting. They got it. But what's happening now, with the rise of anti-Semitism, with the murder of George Floyd, with the national reckoning on race, is a real sense that a whole lot of Jewish people are feeling the marginality and are getting connected back to the atrocities of the history, and are re-engaging and getting proximal in ways that that these generations have not been, at least since the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, and I guess just to add on that, and I would love to hear anyone answer this question, but I'm wondering what do you think the drawbacks have been from this narrative of this incomplete narrative that you have just described?
Happy to let someone
For Jews and for, activism broadly.
Can I jump in? I mean, I guess I appreciate Mark's comments, which I agree with. It strikes me that becoming white was an agonizing process. Obviously, it brought huge material benefits in terms of access to wealth and status and power and all kinds of things. But that doesn't mean that that form of racialization doesn't inflict psychic violence, right? I do think that that's important to bear in mind as we think about how to.
You mean on others or on Jews?
On both. I mean, it both enlists Jews to inflict very real as well as psychic violence on others, right? And I think the crisis of liberal Zionism and the president is a very clear outcome of that process. And at the same time, also, I think it becoming what I mean. This goes to the origins of the kind of scholarly literature on whiteness. That whiteness, becoming white, involves accepting forms of ways of arranging oneself and one's life and one's identity that are themselves disciplinary. And I do think that both dimensions of that have really both created huge problems in the ability of Jews to, even Jews who identify as liberals or even on the left, to carry out and embody the forms of solidarity that our kind of espoused values might urge us to, And again, I think the crisis of liberal Zionism is a clear case of this. But also the kind of disintegration of the Black-Jewish alliance to some degree in the 70s, I think embodies this really well. There's a exchange I was thinking about before this panel in the 70s, after the New York blackout in 77, I think. First of all, neoconservatism generally, right, is like a very clear embodiment of this phenomenon. But after the New York blackout, when there was some amount of looting in the hours that the power was out, the neoconservative Jewish intellectual Midge Decter wrote an op-ed in which she basically described looters as insects who have to be squashed. And the great social historian Herb Gutman wrote an op-ed replying to her, in which he quoted extensively from the 1902 editorial in the New York Times in response to the kosher meat riots that had occurred that year, in which the New York Times described Jewish beef rioters who were demanding cheaper beef as insects who need to be crushed. And so how you get from the moment of the beef rioters in 1902 to Midge Decter in 1977, I think tells a lot of this story and the limits of solidarity that it's imposed on us, and also I think what it has done, what that process does to us ourselves and our own sense of ourselves and our capacities in the world, and the kind of obligations of our ethics.
Carlin, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I think just, first, I really appreciate the comments from both Mark and Gabe on this. And I think that it is a really pertinent question. We're seeing a lot of simultaneous rise of right-wing white Christian nationalism at the same time as there is a increase in anti-Semitism, and those two are very closely related. And it's all part of a rapidly changing and moving political landscape. And anti-Semitism has very real impacts on our daily lived experiences, and the intergenerational trauma that we as Jews experience is very real. And also it is a very different experience than what Black Americans have. In my own life as a Jew of color, I experience a very different lived experience than white Jews. And as a white passing person of color, the privileges that I'm granted because of the way I look are very different than other Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I think that, the hope in this moment for me is that for Jews, we can actually, instead of facing anti-Semitism alone, is that we can join in solidarity with other communities and find that mutual interest in fighting back against white nationalism. And if we also collapse our own experiences and our struggles and don't actually carefully acknowledge and organize from the lived experiences of and center the marginalized voices and understand that there are very real differences based on race, based on class, based on immigration status, and all of these other marginalized identities. By collapsing our struggles, we really lose some of our power in organizing. And so I think that if we organize from a place of building that mutual interest, of building solidarity, but also of honoring our different oppressions, identities, and centering those that are most marginalized, that's how we organize most powerfully against white nationalism.
Yeah, I'll just say, and in 2 minutes we'll go to questions, so type in your questions if you haven't already. I have done a lot of thinking over the last 2 years, I guess, about how, I had sort of a traditional American Jewish education. I didn't go to Jewish day school, but I went to Hebrew school. I did Jewish summer camp for a couple of years. My family, did all the holidays, and I felt like I could, fit in most Jewish spaces, but I plenty of Holocaust education, et cetera, but I really did not really learn in any of those spaces anything about white supremacy in a way that connected anti-Semitism to other. It was like you learn about racism and you learn about anti-Semitism, but you don't learn about white supremacy, and you don't learn about white nationalism, and something about being like going through this Trump administration and just sort of rethinking a lot about American Jewish identity and being Jewish in the world, but also sort of like had this sort of education started earlier, and there's no really I'm curious, Mark, why you think maybe it doesn't, or maybe why that aspect is not part of our narrative. But it does feel like once you start thinking about it in those terms, your whole ethical obligations to other people also looks different, and not completely, but a little bit different from, I think, the way that we're taught it in many Jewish institutions is like, it's a mitzvah to help other people, but Jews are like on their own, kind of like your experience is, it's a lot more insular in a way that it doesn't necessarily have to be. And it's kind of a choice that we've made it this way. Does that make sense?
I was going to say right on. This is exactly where we need to be. It is so complicated and so hard. There is failure of consciousness at least two levels deep. I'll start with sort of the good news from my perspective. Since George Floyd, I've had synagogues and JCCs all over wanting to learn anew on these questions. I wrote up a new lecture, which is basically 350 years of white Jewish complicity with racism or support of or benefit from. I never could have written that thing, much less delivered it anywhere without like being blackballed forever. So the good news is, like, I'm giving this to a congregation in a white suburban neighborhood. And when I get to the end and I'm talking about Brian Stevenson and the import of proximity, And one person in Q&A said, there's not a single Black person that lives within miles of here, right? So step one is just getting them onto the Zoom, right? Step two is recognizing this would be a psychic cost of whiteness, and certainly, where we're going. And then once they understand the essential differences between what it is to be able to enjoy whiteness and privilege, and understand systemic racism, and then we can add on how anti-Semitism works from the same forces that are playing on racism, and then have an honest sense of solidarity in that both sides actually do have a common enemy and need to be side by side, even though we will always have differences of opinions on lots of issues, getting to the liberal Zionism question as well. Yeah, so I do see that in a visionary sense, and I do think we're a lot of work away from actually getting there.
Okay, so we're going to turn to Q&A if that's okay with you guys. I'm excited about this. Carlin, we're going to start with you because there's two questions that I see sort of related that maybe you can tackle together. What comes to mind? So these questions are from Noah Schoen, Jesse Schwartz. So one of them is, Carlin mentioned moving from what might be called a vertical model of solidarity toward a more mutual interest model of solidarity. What does Jewish liminality and professional middleness, like PMC in general, mean for our understandings of solidarity, allyship, and accomplishship? And sort of, I just think this is sort of related. How can Jews with class privilege step into their power organizing in cross-class relationships while also standing against anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews and financial power? Curious how Carlin navigates this today, and also gave in Mark's historical understanding.
I think these are both great questions, and I actually think that they relate to your prior question, Rachel, about how Jews navigate that kind of feeling of aloneness with the idea of supporting others through organizing. And I think that, to me, the answer in my organizing and in the organizing that we do at JFREG is rooted in this idea of collective liberation. So rooted in moving from a vertical organizing that's based around solidarity because we see something that's going on over here that we feel like we need to make it right, versus the idea of mutual interest organizing around our collective liberation, recognizing that regardless of class privilege, that regardless of privilege around any other identity, that our liberation is literally tied up in organizing together around that. And I think that a lot of what we see in our current organizing movements, for example, around long-term care, is built up in that. So we have deeply tied the long-term care organizing movement not only with wages and working conditions for domestic workers, but we've actually tied it in very closely with the entire movement for guaranteed health care, Medicare for all, or whatever you might call it. In fact, in New York last year, we won including universal long-term care into the bill that would provide a single-payer healthcare system in all of New York, recognizing that long-term care is not a struggle that's isolated to us as we age or isolated to people with disabilities, but it's actually part of a broader healthcare struggle that impacts all of us, regardless of class, regardless of race, and also recognizing that people of color, low-income people, immigrants, LGBTQ, transgender, non-conforming folks bear the brunt of a healthcare system that is meant to profit off of our illness instead of promote our wellness. And I think that to me, that's the core of all of those questions, and what really ties them together is that when we organize for our collective liberation, that is the only way that we're actually going to organize in a way that we win.
Can I add to that? I really agree with that and find that very powerful. And I think in my experience in organizing an activist context, as well as thinking as a historian, I think the reason that I said what I said a few minutes ago about the psychic violence of accepting whiteness or becoming white is, I think, facing that and instead asserting a positive identity in Jewishness and the diasporic historical tradition gives us a way of locating ourselves as specific kinds of subjects and political actors that lets it's similar to how if professionals acknowledge themselves as professionals with their own positionality, it actually makes it more possible to build alliances than if you pretend to be working class, right? Similarly, if Jews, I think the contradictions of embodying Jewish whiteness and the vulnerabilities that come with the rise of anti-Semitism actually give us an opportunity to locate ourselves in a specific position from which it's possible to build forms of solidarity, as opposed to the kinds of charity, right, that we risk engaging in otherwise if we approach politics otherwise from a kind of less specified place.
If I can jump in, I really appreciate, Carlin, your comment, because what I'm hearing is just a fundamentally new understanding of sort of social relations. In the 1950s, it was all about consensus, but the consensus was rooted in a liberal anti-communism and sort of a white middle class approach that did all it could to squash out extremes on either side. So typically, when we see the notion of the word consensus, it's loaded with all that. And then the mid 60s are seen as a time of conflict, identity, ethnic, racial, gender, and everything sort of, that all the good consensus era created gets thrown away. And then what are we left with, in the 70s and 80s? And as you're describing, I'm hearing the development of a new consensus, and a new consensus rooted in common interest and rooted on a line that can actually legitimately and authentically bring people together through shared experience and shared visions and dreams for what they're looking for. So to me, that's like a really nice coda on this whole thing.
Gabe, and maybe Mark, seems like a question that is more for you. There's a question of, was the rise of the PMC in the professional managerial class in the late 1960s and into the 70s, and the shift of leftist organizing towards nonprofits, do you think that has contributed to the weakening of the Jewish left, Jewish socialist tendencies like the Jewish Labor Fund and other things?
Sure. It probably somewhat. I think, first of all, the first thing you have to say to the question of what weakened the Jewish socialist left, as from its peak in the 30s and 40s, is McCarthyism, right? Which obviously had huge anti-Semitic, quite explicit or nearly explicit anti-Semitic dimensions, and enacted repression on a scale much larger than is commonly remembered today. Millions of Americans, in one way or another, were surveilled or investigated. And obviously, in the person of the Rosenbergs, right, even led to, anti-Semitic execution. But that being said, I think the story of upward mobility that we've been telling here, it's difficult to think doesn't play a role in that. But I think, the power of the ideas and the debate around the idea of a new working class emerging in the context of the student left really should be taken seriously, regardless of exactly where you come down on it. When activists and theorists were arguing that the rise of mass higher education, right, which was the vehicle of upward mobility to some degree, the rise of mass higher education was serving some kind of social function, right? It wasn't just like because the government was nice. It was because the Cold War and the context of post-war capitalism required a more educated workforce. And it brought together millions of people, including, that whole new generation of Jews going to college where their parents hadn't, in these kind of mass contexts of especially the public universities. And that then gave rise to new forms of radicalism and organization. It wasn't the Labor Fund, but I think it's fair to see a kind of ongoing material and social economic process producing new forms of radicalism with economic development. So I don't know that it's right to see it as a kind of decline story exactly, but certainly not having, hundreds of thousands of garment workers anymore probably played a role in the absence of that kind of politics.
Carlin, this question for you. What are the most effective messages and strategies that you found in connecting the needs of aging people and domestic workers, and how can these messages and strategies maybe be implemented across other spheres? I know we've been talking a lot about our shared struggle and collective liberation, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things that in the campaign we really try to root our messaging around. One of them is in our own stories and our own lived experiences. And so understanding that long-term care is not this thing that is like maybe far off in the distance or only impacts certain people, but that actually everybody has a care story. And if you spend time thinking about it, it might be your own story, it might be your parents, it might be somebody that you know that is either receiving home care or has been working in that field, but everybody has a care story, and that should be where our own organizing begins and how we connect with other people. And that's how we begin to recognize that this is actually an issue that impacts all of us and that we should all be organizing around. But that's also where we begin to see the connections to other issues. So how does this connect to healthcare more broadly? How does it then connect to mental health care? How does it connect to labor and employment and housing and all of these other issues that we see as deeply interconnected? But I think that starting with our own lived experience and building connections with others based on that is how we really build that in a meaningful and authentic way.
I wanted to also ask if any of you guys have questions for each other. You should feel free to take this opportunity.
I just love to ask Carlin, how optimistic are you, and specifically just in your life and career, given the racial reckoning and the protests, COVID, the election, like this whole moment, you know, for me as an academic, like I don't think I've seen this in 50 or 60 years, and I'm just curious on your perspective about how big this actually is.
You know, that's a great question, Mark, and I think that a lot of my friends will tell you that I'm a pretty pessimistic person. I think that we have no choice but to hope. And I've seen a lot of moments that give me a lot of hope in the past few months, despite how difficult they've been on all of us in really different ways. I think that we're, you know, even everything that we talk about being rooted in history, I think that we are in a different moment of politics and of consciousness and of community care and of organizing. And despite my natural tendency towards pessimism, I think that we have to hope that it's going to build something new and hopefully destroy some things that it's time we leave behind.
Sorry, I was just reading the hostile comment I got in the Q&A from one of our viewers. Anyway, does does anyone else do either of you have any other questions? We can go back to that.
I think that I would ask one question of Gabe and Mark and either of you, because I've just been so grateful for the chance as an organizer to really learn from the two of you, both before this panel and on this panel. As historians, what's the piece of advice that you would give to organizers today based on the work that you do?
I'll jump in. I'm actually going to take this from someone else I heard on TV, and it was sort of related to my question of you. And you know, I don't think it's my place to express optimism or pessimism about whether we can bring change to systemic institutions now. And you know, what I heard was, you know, we may not have success now, but if we don't, it will literally be another 100 years before this kind of window opens to bring it on a national scale. And then I found that to be a very motivating statement, which is honest to say these are tough systems to break, but it's also honest to say that we are in maybe a once in a century moment. So if that helps to inspire.
I guess I would say, a thing that I often think about and often have said in organizing contexts as well as scholarly ones is that the breakthrough in the labor movement in the 1930s came after one of the worst periods of defeat the labor movement had ever experienced from the end of World War I to the 20s. The end of World War I was followed by the first Red Scare, large-scale deportations, expulsions, arrests, including famously Emma Goldman, and then a sort of vicious campaign against organized labor. And you would not have guessed from that vantage point that something like the 1930s was a decade and a half off. And many things obviously made the New Deal and the victories of the 30s possible. But one was the presence of, in some ways a quite small, although from our perspective today, maybe a very large stratum of activists who survived the repression of the 20s and stayed where they were and kept doing what they had been doing in one form or another, such that, every factory, every garment shop, every, mill, whatever in the country, there were Reds, and their coworkers knew who they were mainly knew not to talk to them too much. But when the Depression came and people were really, under the gun economically and desperate, they also then knew who to go talk to, right? And those people went from being pariahs somewhat to being leaders of a mass movement that transformed the country. And they came in many different ideological flavors. Many were communists and socialists. Lots were other things too. Lots were Jews, particularly in big cities and certain industries. And it's something I've often thought about, when I have been organizing and also as a historian, that it takes a huge amount of work to, sustain oneself and one's own optimism and one's own kind of commitments through periods of defeat. And we can't always see, obviously, the ways that it's going to pay off, but historically, it very often has in unexpected ways.
Okay, so this is a bit of a hard question, sort of a morphed from a audience question, but how this is, we've kind of we've talked about activism, labor, Jews, class. One thing that Mark's research sort of helped, I think, bring to light is also, and this is something a lot of us know, but we don't always talk about, that there were, Jews in poverty that sort of get obscured by some of the narratives that we talk about Jews economically in the United States. I think a question that I feel like all of you guys might have slightly different answers on, and or you don't have to have full answers, but how do we talk about Jews in class without obscuring portions of the community, without glossing over real power dynamics that exist, without feeding anti-Semitic conspiracies and sort of like keeping these stereotypes at bay that are pernicious and harmful? How do we do that? I think a lot of times the answer has just been to not talk about it at all because it's kind of hard, or it's not straightforward. And so I'm wondering if in all of your work, how that has come up. And I know that's like sort of a thing to throw in at the end, but that's what we're gonna do.
I'm happy to get started. This was a chapter in the book. So the first thing we have to say is that all communities are segmented, in that they're diverse and complex. And because the normative study of white American Jews is of upward social and economic mobility, that tends to be where the academic historians go, and we tend to put the rest into the footnotes. So at least in the 1960s and early 70s, when I'm doing my research, we find that there are at least three groups of American Jews that are not on the train to the suburbs, right? First are elderly. a disproportionate number of older Jews are going to be in lower socioeconomic strata. Second, the Orthodox community is also more economically impoverished. And third, related to the first two, those that are not moving to the suburbs because they can't afford to go to the suburbs when the story moves from the cities and they get ignored. We've had a few really good books that take this kind of perspective. What I find fascinating is two responses. One was A Great Society. And the challenges, and here this will play on the earlier idea of white Ashkenazi Jews, were not considered historically designated minority groups for the purpose of federal government support in the Great Society. And now we had, working class Jews screaming and yelling, yes, I'm Jewish, yes, I'm white, and by the way, I'm also poor, and my narrative doesn't fit into all of the other narratives, and I'm lost. And we do have a leftist interest in those groups. And on the flip side, the Jewish Defense League plays on this class ignorance in order to represent the lower income Jews in the cities. And of course, they're playing it through a racial lens because these communities are now populated by people of color. And so much of the JDL is supposedly protecting, white Jews, in these surroundings. But we do have leftist and rightist responses to a group that is otherwise forgotten. I just find that fascinating.
I guess I would just say quickly that I think it's helpful to think of class not as an identity of individuals, but as an ongoing process that we're caught up in various ways, as a historical process. And once you start thinking of it that way, then, the contradictions of class, I think, become easier to think about, the ways in which, you can make more money, for example, but also be subject to someone else's power. And the strange affiliations and lack of affiliations that can happen too. Why are all workers not showing solidarity together all the time, right? This is the question that on the left, people, I think, especially when they first get oriented to the left, often start asking. And it has to do with the historical trajectory of class as something that's always developing and changing and decomposing and recomposing. And I take optimism, I draw optimism from that fact, from the way in which a kind of the normative upward mobility story is actually a historically specific process that has run out of gas in a lot of ways, right? And that, I think, for lots of us in different ways.
What do you mean by that?
That, well, as the professional careers that powered upward mobility have fallen apart since, the 80s and 90s somewhat. It's much harder to make a living as a journalist, as an academic, even as a doctor or a lawyer, potentially. That as that has happened, right, there's a kind of new set of possibilities for solidarity that emerge. And with those new possibilities for solidarity, also, I think, new openings in Jewish identity. For example, I don't know that we would see young Jews developing the criticisms of Zionism that we've seen in the last decade or two, that I feel very proud of and inspired by. If the same kinds of upward mobility that had obtained in the 50s and 60s still did now. So I think, thinking of it as a dynamic historical process rather than an individual identity helps us see new possibilities in that way.
I think I would add, so I'm Jewish and Asian, and so I'm a member of two identity groups that are very much subject to the subsuming of poor and working class members of those groups into a certain framing. So, Jews as wealthy, of belonging to the financial class, obscuring the reality and the history of poor and working class Jews. Similarly, Asians, the model minority myth is incredibly pervasive around the idea that all Asians are successful and wealthy, and actually obscures that Asian Americans have the highest poverty rate in New York. That the wealth gap between the wealthiest and the poorest Asian Americans is broader than any other racial and ethnic category. And when it comes to these kinds of analyses, the question that I always ask myself is who stands to benefit by collapsing these groups within the myth or whatever it might be, that we don't actually have these very real class differences between us. And it is to me the same answer of who stands to benefit by making us all the same as who stands to benefit by dividing us. And I think that's where we actually have to look at the role that history plays in these, and Mark and Gabe spoke about it on the Jewish side, but in the Asian American community, what we see is that in the 1960s and 70s, the model minority myth occurred because there were so many East Asian refugees coming to the United States that were doing really well and were pitted against Black Americans to say, if Asians can assimilate to white society in this way, why are Black Americans not? And so it was serving as a wedge to create divisions between working class people, between Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, in order to serve whiteness and in order to continue to maintain white supremacy. And so I think that as we examine the role that dominant narrative plays in continuing to reinforce anti-Blackness in the US today, that's also where we have to actively work against it in order to actually build solidarity among working class people, to actually build a successful multiracial working class movement that is going to fight for all of these things that we're talking about.
Well, we have reached the time at the end of our panel. I want to just thank all three of you so much, and for the over 110 people still listening to this conversation on your Thursday. Thank you so much. Thank you to Jewish Currents. Thank you to Hadassah, the conference, which is going on tomorrow too, for another session. Do you guys have anything that you want to say before we close out? I'm really grateful for this conversation, and thank you so much for being so thoughtful on questions that range from hard to less hard.
Thanks, Rachel. Great job.
Thank you.
Appreciate it being here. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and read Jewish Currents. Okay.